What motivates me might not actually motivate you, and that's kind of a good thing. That might sound a little bit off, but let me explain further. Right now, one of the most popular questions that I come across, whether that's in books I read, self-improvement videos I watch, or even just questions on Quora and different forums, it's this idea of how do I stay motivated? What motivates you, and how can I do the thing I know I need to do despite not having the motivation to do it? That's why in this week's episode of the Keeping Everything Simple podcast, I'm going to dive into what motivation means to me and kind of how I've been answering these questions and how you guys are also able to define motivation and move forward with a plan of action to allow you to not just rely on it, but instead to own it. But first, keeping everything simple, let's dive into why motivation itself can be a barrier. Welcome back to the Keeping Everything Simple podcast. I'm your host and fellow learner, Michael Klucas. And on this show, we boil down complex topics into simple, actionable tips. So a little while ago on my Instagram, which is KES Studios, I had asked this question in a reel to say essentially, what's your story? Like, what's your background? What's your motivation? And how did you get to where you are today? The reason I asked that is because, and I believe I've mentioned this in the past too, that no matter what you come from, no matter where you come from, everyone's story is gonna be a little bit different. It's gonna be unique to them, and it's gonna be unique to their experiences and how they perceived their experiences. So I asked that question because I was interested in finding out what has impacted people the most and how they've grown or how they've gone through these different times and different situations in their life and what got them through it to begin with. And the reason why it's so interesting for me was the fact that there's two schools of thought, which would be the motivation camp versus the discipline camp. And more often than not, they are usually the solutions that you get when asking how do you stay motivated. You tend to hear, well, you have to be disciplined instead of motivated. And that itself can kind of create some problems, kind of create some conflict with that. But we'll circle back to the major conflict between these two camps in the next segment. But first and foremost, as I said, these are kind of the two solutions that you get is how do you stay motivated? Well, there's the idea that motivation just comes naturally, or it's something that you can't really influence. It's just there or it's not, versus discipline where you won't always be motivated, but instead what you can do is you can design systems and ways to allow yourself to get the work done even on the days that you aren't motivated. But again, we'll dive further than that a little bit later. I just wanted to touch on it because that kind of sets the cornerstone for the ways of finding solutions to having low motivation, while at the same time not discrediting the fact that these two camps don't have to be at odds. It doesn't have to be one or the other. One of the other reasons why I point out that these two camps are the two of the camps, motivation and discipline, they don't have to be, at odds, is the fact that we have limited mental energy. So like every single day, there is only so much that we're able to think of, that we're able to do, that we can make decisions on because we have limited mental energy and we have limited willpower, decision-making energy. It just is not infinite. And that's something we have to recognize, especially when it comes to this idea of how do we stay motivated when there's so many things that we need to also dedicate time and energy towards. A great example can be if you have to, say, clean the house or, pack your lunches and get your clothes ready the night before. That helps alleviate some of the decision-making energy that you'll have to do the next day. It's small, but it's why you'd see like Steve Jobs or Alex Hormozy nowadays, or just people in general simplifying their wardrobes or wearing the same exact thing because it eliminates a decision. It allows them to have extra mental energy throughout their day because they don't have to waste it on some of the more minute and not as important decisions. And this is where you have to really focus on how are you preserving your mental energy just in general, as well as how are you going to adjust your routines, adjust your habits to allow yourself to impact your mental energy in a more positive way, so that way you can use it when it counts on some of the more, I would say, more the big task or the things that really push that needle of your progress in whatever you're working on forward. So you have to always be aware that you don't have an infinite amount of willpower, and you definitely don't have an infinite amount of mental energy too. And this is something that I have been victim of, because I will always choose to try to do a whole lot more than sometimes is even good for me to do. And that's both in my personal and professional life, but it's something that I have to be aware of, that I'm not able to always be going at 100% no matter what. Because it is true that if we were able to unlock our motivation and be motivated all the time at 100%, we would get a lot more things done. That is true. But it's not quite that simple. To be able to then say, well, I would have the motivation to always do the right thing for my work, my professional life, is impossible. Because it's impossible for us to always make the right decision. It's impossible for us to always be operating at 100%, firing on all cylinders, because at some point we will reach our limit, and that's where our motivation falls off. That's where it becomes a struggle for us to want to do the things that we love. That's where it becomes a struggle for us to want to continue to push through even during the slow or the hard times, which is why I want to emphasize the fact that losing motivation at times is perfectly okay, perfectly normal, and it's not something that you have to worry about and stress about if you have a plan of action when those times do happen. All right, so launching into the next segment here, this is going to be about kind of the conflict again, as I mentioned previously, between motivation and discipline. So starting off with that one, again, the two camps of thought. Motivation, the will to do something, discipline, the systems to do something. I think that is one of the easiest ways that I can explain that. It's that you have to be careful between them, because for one thing, in terms of motivation, you might be motivated by the wrong things. Now, I've talked about the locus of control previously, and that is the internal locus of control, the external locus of control. External obviously being external factors. That could be your friend group, it could be societal norms, it could be something that you were taught as a child that you don't believe anymore, but you can't really quite get past that barrier. Then there's internal motivations, where you feel like, hey, it depends on how much work I put in. It's all based on my input goals and what I'm doing. And for those, it's important that we don't gloss over how much we can struggle between which factors are actually motivating us. Because if we are focusing on the wrong ones, we're never going to have enough motivation, quote unquote, to be able to push that progress forward on the things that are important to us, because we're going to be focusing so much on trying to appease or trying to meet these external requirements that might not mean anything to us personally. And that's where we have to be careful between what are we actually doing and why are we actually doing it to begin with. A conflict people then have in terms of the discipline camp is that there's so many videos on self-discipline or self-improvement, and they tend to have routines everywhere. But the problem that people tend to face on this, and so many of these authors and these creators know this as well, and they will emphasize this, is you shouldn't be copying and pasting their routines, their systems, and just expecting it to work for you. That is only the starting point, where it has to be refined further and further. So in Tiago Forte's book, The Second Brain, that's one of the lines that he says in there, is that the second brain is a tool, just like any other tool. You choose to pick it up and use it at different points, and at the same time, how you use it is going to differ. There may be pieces in there that you'll use that he's never thought of, or that you'll choose to leave out because it's not necessary for the chapter that you're in. Same thing with like Andrew Huberman and his morning routine, or Matt D'Avella or Ali Abdaal and their morning routine. Whatever it is, the morning routine is important. But if you are going to copy and paste someone's morning routine, then you have to be prepared to not have it work at 100% because it won't work perfectly for everybody. And that's just due to the unique differences between each and every individual. Someone who is a night owl and by their natural sleep chronotype, they will wake up later and want to be awake later. That's where their peak energy level is. Forcing themselves to wake up at 5 a.m. doesn't quite have the same impact when they can wake up a little bit later, say 9 or 10 a.m., stay up later into the night, but then have their peak work hours happen at night. And this is where it's unique to say between motivation and discipline. If you aren't working on a system that makes sense for you, that adheres to your inborn traits, talents, and quirks, then it's not going to always be effective to say, I'm just going to copy and paste Andrew Huberman's morning routine, or I'm going to copy and paste the Miracle Morning. There can be pieces in there that you can, but the overall system itself has to be adapted to your particular needs. And that's where we kind of get it wrong, because we think these are cure-alls to our lack of motivation, but they're not. They're a stepping stone in the actual progress of gaining motivation and gaining discipline. And one of the final conflicts there is that it's not something that we personally identify with. Like, we don't identify ourselves as a motivated person or as a motivated individual, and that causes its own host of problems, distinctly because if you don't believe you can, then you're going to have a harder time actively creating the results that you want to see. So I believe it was Henry Ford that has the quote that says, if you believe you can or you can't, you are right. Because if you actively tell yourself, I'm not disciplined, I'm not motivated, then I'm not going to be able to make it happen, you're right. But if you are able to adjust your personality, adjust what you believe and how you internally speak to yourself about the matter, it can change to say, I am a disciplined person, or I am someone that wants to have this morning or this morning routine, and I can make it happen and I can make it work for me. That is a small shift. It's a small change to your internal dialogue, but that does change the picture and change how you're approaching this matter, because it's no longer then a conflict and a barrier. Instead, it is a way for you to see a path forward. And even with all these ways and all these conflicts, one of the larger ones that comes in is there's a focus often on just surviving the day rather than constructing your day around what you need. And obviously there's barriers to that too, because if you have things like work and school and family obligations and maybe projects and team obligations, it can be hard to feel like you are in control of your day, because it just feels like I have to get from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. to clock out, and then I get to just relax and I have time to recharge before doing it all again the next day. And when you're faced with that reality, finding time for yourself can feel impossible. And it can feel like you don't have space to just explore the things you want to explore when you're so focused on, again, getting from one day to the next, getting from one weekend to the next. And despite that emphasis on surviving, there can also be two ways that this takes shape: that you're either very overwhelmed, you feel like you're not able to, again, carve out time for yourself to dedicate towards your development, dedicate towards your hobbies, your interests, and explore what means something to you. Or, again, the opposite here, so the other side of the coin, is that you're actually really comfortable and you are stagnating a little bit because you don't have a huge urge to change anything right now. You don't have some external factor or internal factor saying we have to change something, we have to change our habits, because you are comfortable where you're at. Maybe you're secure, which is good, but you don't have any fire in your belly, essentially, to say I have to do something that's going to push my needle of development forward and explore something new and change a little bit of who I am. And for all these points of conflict, it does stand to reason that it boils down to, how are we approaching this matter? How are we approaching the situation? And what can we do personally to make it something that we're able to overcome, even, again, when the times are tough? we're going to dig into the resolutions and some of my personal pieces of advice on this matter of motivation versus discipline. The first thing that I want to focus on is how I view the connection between your motivation and your discipline, being the fact that your motivation is your fuel, but your discipline is the ignition. Whether you want to think of this in terms of like a car or a fire, I'm gonna use a fire. That feels a bit more accurate. So the motivation is just the logs of wood that you are stacking up to be burned later, because they're going to be flashes of motivation. They're going to be flashes of heat and energy and excitement, and that can be for different things. So one log can be that motivation to do really well on a personal project. Another one can be motivation to do really well on an upcoming end of month report you have to do for work. Another can be motivation for a problem that you're having in a relationship, but you really want to solve it with your significant other or your friend or your family member, whoever it is. And this is the fuel. These are the pieces that are gonna, again, ignite they're gonna release the energy. They're gonna let you actually take action and move forward. But that's the fuel. Just the fuel itself is good, but it's not always going to be enough. That's where discipline, which is the ignition, comes in, and that can be the match that you throw into the fire. That can be the accelerant that you use along with the match, and it allows you to not only take action on those different pillars or different logs of motivation, but instead it allows you to say, okay, I need to do this and it needs to happen, so I just need to start the process. And that means using my system, using my habits and my pattern to get the ball rolling, because following the first law of physics is that an object in motion will stay in motion. So if you're making progress, then it's going to be that much harder to stop making progress. So that is how I'm viewing this kind of relationship between the two of them, is that they aren't incompatible. They aren't one versus the other. Instead, it's if you are lacking motivation at times, then you might need more accelerant, versus if you have a lot of motivation at times, then the ignition will come that much easier. It just depends on how you're marrying them together and how you are taking action consistently over time, without the extra emphasis on it has to be right every single time, I have to get it perfect every single time, when instead it's I just have to get moving every single time. A great example for that is even just today. So it's currently 6:35 in the morning on the time that I'm filming this, and I didn't want to get out of bed. I was comfortable, I was warm, and I ended up sleeping in for an extra hour, which I did the same thing the day before. And that's not a bad thing. I know that I need rest, and this could just be my body's way of saying, hey, you've been waking up at 5 for the past, year now, if not more, and having a little bit of extra rest is good. And that just could be a signal for me to figure out, how am I going to change this system a little bit, so that way the motivation I have to do things early morning is still there without being negatively impacted. And that's where the next piece comes in, which is removing barriers to starting. So you want to make something as easy as possible to get started, because the more confidence you have to beginning or getting some progress made, the harder it's going to be to stick with it. And so I'll use, again, my getting out of bed super early in the morning. I like getting up at 5 a.m. because it gives me time to do personal projects, gives me time to focus on my personal development, things that I like to do on my own time. But if I have my fiance, the wedding planning, trying to find time for family and friends, and just relaxing in the afternoon, then it can be much harder for me to carve out dedicated space for it when I have the other pillars of my life that I want to support. So that's where you want to remove the barriers to you starting. So for myself, that is something as simple as, if I am struggling to wake up at 5 at the moment, then maybe I should go to bed like half an hour earlier, and get a little bit more sleep. So that way I feel the less of the need to hit snooze. Or for working out, because that's when I find time to work out is early morning, then it's me saying, okay, get the clothes out, figure out what my workout's going to be. Is it going to be a full body workout day? Is it going to be a push day? Do I need to just get into some warm clothes because it's kind of freezing temperatures right now and just go for a walk? Is that what I'm doing? So I need to remove the barriers to starting. And for yourself too, you can use it in any capacity as long as you are trying to make it easier to start, easier to not get distracted, and then easier to actually end these sessions of work, so that way okay, I've started the progress, I've reached my goal for the day, and that is good. Now I can make the choice either to continue or to stop, one or the other, but it starts with you removing friction, so that way it's easier to fall into that habit and fall into the work that you want to do to begin with. And this is all because ultimately, even small bits of meaningful work is better than none at all. Because if you were someone that does, 10 push-ups, 10 sit-ups, 10 squats every single day, and you slowly just kind of up it over time, but it's never something that's super, super crazy or super, super heavy in the workout, that's still going to be better than someone that never does a workout, that is sedentary, that always chooses to sit down and lay down. You will be in a better spot, and it's small amounts of change and small amounts of effort that compound over time. It's the same as with investing, where it's like, if I'm going to dedicate a little bit of money every single month, every single week towards my investments for retirement, it's going to naturally compound over time, no matter what. And you want to think about motivation and discipline in the same way. These are tools that will allow you to get small amounts of work done, but the more meaningful the work is, the more over the long run, it's going to be impactful in the goals that you're trying to reach. So you're going to want to remember that motivation and discipline are compatible. Motivation is the fuel, discipline is the ignition. You want to make sure you're removing barriers and removing friction to you getting started, so that way it's easier to get that ball rolling, because that will help you stay in motion. And then allowing yourself to have even small amounts of meaningful work completed, and knowing that over the long time horizon that you've set for yourself, that will generate more results than you doing no work over a long period of time as well. If you're watching this on YouTube, comment down below, what is your relationship between motivation and discipline, and how have you generated systems and ways of getting started that have made it easier for you to make progress on your goals? And also make sure that you like this video and subscribe to it on our YouTube channel. If you're listening on a podcast app of choice, make sure that you leave us a rating. It helps other people discover the show and helps us out so much. Have an amazing day, you amazing people, and I will see you all in the next episode. Go out there and do great things.